So why are we interested in economic history? Why is economic history important? I think there might be more, but there's certainly three reasons that I can think of. The first is that history explains the present. And I think South African economists, at least, are realizing that this is certainly true if you think about poverty, if you think about inequality. For a long time, most of what you've read, or at least over the last 10 years or so, what you've read about poverty and inequality is all of those things have started really in 1993, it seems, where the first survey has been run. So a lot of the development work has been done over the last decade, has only focused on the last decade, and maybe a bit before that, the last 2 decades. And we are realizing that we can't really understand this persistence of inequality and poverty without understanding where it comes from before 1994. And so we'll see that in this session, I'll say a little bit about persistence, but that's a big debate in economic history, is this persistence of past effects explaining the present. How slavery in 500 years ago affects African development still today, these type of persistent stories. People are even going back to the out of Africa hypothesis, so the migration out of Africa, how that affects development patterns today. But these things, you can see that economists are imperial in this sense, in conquering other fields, and historians don't always like the way we deal with history, this effect where we just say that the past causes the present without actually acknowledging that there's a lot of different things happening in the past. But still, I think that's a very important aspect. The second thing, I think this is where my interest in lies, is that we can learn from the past for development policy or different kinds of policy decisions today. So the past is analogous to the present. So we can take the past experience, see what has been done. In a sense, that's like a laboratory where economists can look at the past, see what happened, and then affect and see what the effects of those changes were, and perhaps then look at today's conundrums and challenges, and then say, okay, well, this worked in the past, let's try that again, but maybe this didn't work, so let's do something different. And I think the most obvious example here is Benjamin Ranke's experience in his PhD. He studied the Great Depression. He was also the chairperson of the Reserve Bank, and during the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And so he could learn from the past experience, see what the monetary policies were like in those times in the 1930s, and learn what they did wrong, and we could correct that in 2007, 2008. And so we had a far less dramatic decline this time around. And thirdly, and there's a lot of economic historians and certainly historians that see the past simply as it's interesting in itself. It's like traveling to a different country and experiencing new things. And this is also, I think, and sometimes actually the work that I do, especially just recording things that historians may have not found very interesting, but recording them now so that they can be used to future generations again in looking at the past. And I'll show you some of the data that I'm talking about. So I'm going to divide today's session into three parts. The first one will be the longest one, which will focus on my PhD research and ongoing research on the Cape Colony. The second part will be a very short part on 19th century, the impact of the railways on South Africa. And thirdly, I'm going to look at living standards, broadly speaking, at the start of the 20th century. And each time you'll see I use data to inform what historians have written and perhaps to content what they have said. And hopefully that will be interesting to you. If you have any questions, then again, please feel free to ask. Okay, this is exactly what I just said. Okay, so when I present this to an international audience, usually an American audience, they would say, well, why do we care about the Cape Colony? This tiny little settlement in the corner of the southern tip of Africa, who cares that it's interesting? It's only 2,000, 3,000 people at the start of the mid-18th century, so why is this important for an international audience? And I've got three answers to that. The first is that South Africa is in many respects similar to the US experience. So we have also had slavery, we had civil war, we have a lot of internal migration, we have an indigenous population, where some people who kind of pretty much disappeared, or large part of them disappeared, similar to the States, the indigenous population of first peoples that were inhabiting the States before European settlers arrived. But in one big respect, we are different. We have a large indigenous population that survived the arrival of Europeans, and that is the black population. And so the institutional changes or differences between the states and between South Africa are really interesting, because you can actually see how the institutions differ and how people adapt to these new types of institutions. So I think there's comparison, but with an edge that we have in South Africa. Secondly, South Africa is a microcosm at the moment for the world. So we've got a very developed, people like to call it first world part of South Africa, and we've got a third world or underdeveloped world. And that's similar to the rest of the world. And we see that for the large part of the 20th century, the world was this, that had this great divergence between the rich West and the rest. And there's still something advanced calling it the Western world and the Western world. That world's changing now. So we see that China and India is catching up quite quickly. They're still poorer, obviously, than the West, but they're growing certainly much faster. But still, South Africa has got this massive inequality, and the world has got this massive inequality. So there are parallels that you can draw. Interesting example there is that we would expect in a world where we live with boundaries, and all countries have boundaries, and it's difficult to get a visa to travel to Europe and all of these things. You would expect that if those boundaries fall, that people will just migrate as soon as they can. That's our inclination. But what happened after 1994? When similar barriers to movement were removed in South Africa, where you also have rich parts and you have poor parts, you do see migration, but you still see that the poverty-stricken areas are still persistent in those former homelands. So you don't see the massive migration patterns that you would have expected, or that we currently would expect if we reduce barriers in the rest of the world. So these are interesting, again, conundrums that one can explore. And thirdly, why do we care about the Cape Colony? Because we've got a lot of data. And for economists, that is key if you want to answer interesting questions. So for those of you, I'm pretty sure most of you are South African, or at least know South African history. But just very briefly, so these European settlers from Holland arrived in 1652. They settled. The plan obviously is not initially to colonize Africa, it's simply to form this small refreshment station, and then they soon realized that it's really difficult to trade with the Khoisan, at least on the terms that they want, and so they allow settlement, and that then expands into what we know as the Cape Colony. You'll see the borders, I'm not sure if you can see more clearly on those slides, but the borders expand, and after about 150 years, you'll see that the region of today's Western Cape and half pretty much of today's Eastern Cape is settled by these frontier farms. And then after that, the British take over. About 40 years later, there's the great trek into the interior. Diamonds are discovered 1860, Anglo-Boer War at the end of that century, and then 1910 is Union. Okay, so with those 4 different provinces. So that's a very, very brief history of South Africa. So what do we know about this Cape Colony in terms of its economy? For a long time, there's been a lot of economic historians that's written about this, especially in the early 20th century. And the general perception was that the economy was doing poorly, it was a static economy, and especially if you look at the farmers, they were living just above subsistence levels. So these guys were poor. If you look at the European travelers that arrive at the Cape, they write in their journals that these farmers are wearing veldskoenen, and they are using very basic equipment. Their houses are full of dust, they don't have, it's very basic. So that's the kind of perception people had about this, and still have, I think, about this early Cape Colony. And to me, that was a bit surprising, right? If you just walk around in Stellenbosch and you look at the dates of these houses when they were built, some of these houses were built at the end of the 18th century, and they are fantastic houses. Even today, by today's standards, they are massive houses. Right? So by then standards, they must have been incredibly, must have been mansions. So, and how historians have accounted for these is that they've said, we know about these houses, but they were pockets of wealth. So there were 1 or 2 really rich people. Similar in the kind of in the literature as to what people would have said of the American South. So American South, there were rich farmers, but there was a lot of poverty below that. Right? And so that's the general kind of impression of the Cape. Van Duyn and Ross then wrote in 1987. They said, well, this is quite interesting. Let's just see if we can back this up with numbers. And what they then find is that, well, this is problematic because the numbers suggest that the scape is actually growing faster than people thought they're growing firstly, and they also seem to be quite relatively rich on average, but they're not sure, so they just, at the end of the paper, they say the backwardness of the colony at the end of the 18th century has yet to be fully challenged or indeed fully investigated. So that's tough sentence you want to hear if you're looking for a PhD topic. Because that's exactly what you can do if you have a little bit of data and you want to say something novel, something new. So this is exactly what I did. I used a number of probate inventories. Probate inventories are lists of assets when people die. So when a farmer would have died, a neighbor or a player in Cape Town would have gone to the farm, they would have collected all his possessions. They were very meticulous, so they even had entries of unclean underwear in there, so extremely meticulous. And so I looked at 2,500 of these probates and just counted 28 different products in these. So they range from slaves, as economists look at slaves as commodities, so slaves, cattle, sheep, but also productive assets like animals, brandy stocks, these kind of things, and then more household type items like beds, chairs, and also luxury items, gold rings, books, paintings, and so forth. So these are the things I simply count them. It takes a bit longer than just mentioning. I count them. It took about 4 months of 10 hours a day because they are quite detailed and many entries like cattle. You can't imagine how many versions of the word cattle there are in Dutch, or at least that old version of Afrikaans. And so you have to count and recount a lot of times. So this graph just shows you the number of probates over the 18th century. Right? So we start pretty much at the start of the 18th century and it runs all the way until the end of the period. As farmers moved into the interior, you also see that there are double entries. So the same farmer would have an entry, and that's usually collected by a neighbor, so it's really strange language. It's something that we recognize perhaps more as Afrikaans than the Dutch would recognize as Dutch. So you can also see how the language develops over time. But you can also see that the number of double entries kind of increase. So this is as they move away from the colony, they have to have someone else reporting their assets. So these are the different, I'm pretty sure you won't be able to see that. So these are the 28 products that I look at. You'll see, just to give you a sense of what it tells you, there's, in the total sample that I look at, so I only look at the 18th century, there's about 12,500 slaves, there's about 140,000 cattle. So the total is interesting, but if you look at the more interesting thing, I think, is the mean, right? So that's the average number of cattle each household would own. So on average, when someone died, they owned 50 cattle. Now, I know nothing about farming, but to me that sounds quite a lot, right? And my supervisor in Utrecht, when I told him this, he said, Johan, you must make a mistake somewhere because the average in Holland is about 12. So these are not necessarily the same cattle, but still 50 is incredibly high. Look at the sheep, the number of sheep. On average, farmers, when they died, owned 350 sheep. Right? So that's incredible. You can see that the maximum, there's one guy who owned 10,200 sheep. And this is, you can do this obviously for everyone. You'll see here slaves, the average number of slaves owned was 5. So this is different to the US South, right? In the US South, they had large plantations, cotton plantations, sugar plantations, and so and especially in the Caribbean, they had about 100 slaves per farmer. So this is a different type of economy, and we'll get back to that a bit later. Can we trust these numbers? So this is for economists very important to think about. Are these probates reflecting actual society, or are they just the biased version of the rich people? So they might just be counting all the rich guys, and I'm giving up the poor guys, and that's why I'm finding all this affluence. There's one way to test that, and actually we can do that again because we've got a lot of data, and that is to compare that to another data set that we've got. And the other data set is even more interesting because these are tax records that was collected every year by the company. So that's the benefit, I guess, of being run by a company, is that they are meticulous on the administration. So they kept records every year of everyone in the colony and exactly how much they produced of wheat, barley, rye, oats, and also wine, obviously, cattle, sheep, these kind of things. So we can compare the probates with the with the tax records and see whether they match, right? And the answer, in very short, is that they do. So what I do here is I compare the opgaafrolle, that is the tax records, with the inventories, the probates. And I exclude the zeros simply because zeros can mean two different things in two different censuses. In the one, zeros mean you got a zero if you left the household at the age of 16. Here you could have still been part of the household until the age of 25. So that's why I exclude the zeros. And once you exclude the zeros, you'll see that the averages of the number of slaves in both samples are nearly identical, right? 7.49 versus 7.42. And you can even see that the distribution around this average is nearly exactly the same, 2, 4, 9, and 18, 2, 4, 9, and 17. So to me, that tells me that these two data sets represent the people in the colony. You can also then, what is quite interesting, you can also then calculate how much the tax records are underreported, right? Because people pay tax, they don't want to report all their capital and all the things they produce. So now we know what they actually had, and we can see what they reported. And you can see that the average, because there were no tax on slaves, they are the same. But because there were taxes on cattle, horses, and sheep, you can see that they nearly half their production, or half reported what they had to the company. Right? And that's the rational thing to do. So that supports what historians have said in the past. Okay. So what does it tell us? What does this data tell us? This is just a very basic box plot showing over time that what I want to show is that these guys, firstly, are not, there's not a dramatic decline in their prosperity, right? And secondly, also, I want to compare them with their wealth with other settlers and other citizens of other countries. So this is just showing over time that there is no massive decline in wealth. In fact, you might even say that there's a slight increase. And this is really badly shown, so very small again. But what this is showing is that I'm looking at paintings. I'm only looking at one luxury product, paintings. Books are more difficult because books, sometimes they tell you in a probate, they tell you some books in the house. So I mean, you can't count some books. Right? So that's difficult. So I look at paintings, and they would say in the first room on the left-hand side there were 3 paintings, on the second room on the right-hand side there's 7. So you add all of these things together and you compare the number of paintings. Each household owns 2 households in, and you'll see from the top down, I compare this to a region, a district in Holland, a place called Leeuwarden, also Amsterdam, that's also orphan chamber records, as are my records. 2 places in England, more places in England, and then the Chesapeake region in America, right? And with 1 or 2 exceptions, right? With 1 or 2 exceptions, like London and I think Kent and these places, the farmers of the Cape Colony are on average equal or even more affluent than households in other parts of the world. So they are certainly not, at least I can be quite sure that they are not living at subsistence levels. They own a lot of things on average. And certainly there are high levels of inequality within the settler society. Right? So this is what this graph tries to show you, is that there are different levels of inequality. So I create 4 groups, whether you own 0 slaves, whether you own 1 to 5 slaves, 6 to 15, and more than 15. And you can see that there are big differences, right? It's a logistic scale, so also remember that. But what you can see is over time, if you exclude the number of slaves they own, you can see that the poor are actually getting more affluent. So the poor are catching up, in a sense, to the rich. So the point of the story is there's a lot of wealth. They are comparatively more affluent, or at least equally affluent to citizens of Holland and of England, and certainly more affluent than citizens of America at that stage. Which also makes sense that because they decided to immigrate here, right? So it's not as if there was a lot of immigration from South Africa back to them. People moved here initially when they were still allowed to do that. After the start of the 18th century, Dutch East India Company decided to discourage immigration. And so these guys that were already here could build up quite a lot of fortune. So that's the first part of the story. Why did they have so much wealth? So that's the first is just, did they have a lot of wealth? I find yes. Why did they have a lot of wealth? And as an economist, there's two ways to look at this. You can look at the demand side, you can look at the supply side. So firstly, on the demand side, who wanted their products? Obviously, this was a colony created for the passing ships. Right? So there will always be demand for their goods, which is fantastic if you want to produce a lot of things. You can sell it in the ships. Initially, the demand exceeded the supply. And remember, this is also quite a distorted economy because you have to sell everything you produce to the company, and the company can sell some of the ships. But there's always a demand for your goods, selling it to the company at a fixed price. And so what Probates and I did in 2010 was to look at the business cycles of these ships, how they fluctuate over time, and compare that to the fluctuations in production of these farmers. And you can see that if there's a boom cycle, the farmers start producing more. If there's a trough, then the farmers produce less. Right? So there's a nice correlation there, which we say that it seems to support the story that the demand played an important part. But I think it's on the supply side that we really have to focus, and that's also where I think we can learn lessons about economic growth. Like what is necessary for economic growth? And so we can think of a typical production function. So what is it that causes a country to grow? And economics firstly, you would learn that it's labor, and capital, and technology, and land, perhaps, and various other things, trade, and these kind of things. So we can look at those things, and how did they matter? Well, firstly, if we think about labor, they had access to a lot of cheap labor. Initially, actually, they struggled to find labor, right? So the company restricted them to enslave the Khoisan population. So the farmers were really angry with that. So why? And the company's rule was that obviously, once you enslave an indigenous population, firstly, you create tension. Obviously, you don't want that because then you have to protect yourself. And secondly, also the slaves can run away quite quickly. They know where they're behind. So they weren't allowed to enslave them. And so slaves were brought from East Indies, from India, Mozambique, Madagascar, today currently Malaysia, Indonesia. And these slaves, these were a cheap form of labor once they arrived. There was also an active capital market. Right? So, and this is something that we're exploring now for a PhD student that's doing really interesting work on showing just how enormous this capital market was. So the farmers were borrowing and lending from one another. And typically, economic historians have thought that this was always just in a pre-industrial society like this, with mostly agriculture. You would think that such borrowing and lending would simply be for smoothing the business cycle. So when there's seasonal shock, you borrow, and in a good season you pay back. So it's actually just to protect yourself from borrowing. But what we are showing, what we are finding is that these guys borrowed to invest. Right? So it's the rich guys that are borrowing the most, which is surprising. At least it's interesting for an economic historian, that what we are finding is exactly what we would expect, I guess, from a more capitalist society. So that's one part of the story. And one other part of the story, again, returning to labor, but not only looking at the quantity or the price of labor, but also at the quality of labor. So we found at least that the skills of the settlers matter. Now this might not sound so surprising, that skills matter, but if you look at the literature on the economic history of colonization, most of the studies look at colonization only in terms of the settlers versus the indigenous population. And there's no differentiation in terms of settlers. Who are these settlers? Does it matter whether the settlers come from Italy or whether they come from France or Germany or whatever. And what we are showing in this paper, which I'll explain now, is that actually they do matter. It does matter where they come from. So we looked at the French Huguenots. And again, for most of you, this would be a familiar story, but in 1688, there's about 150 French Huguenots that come to South Africa. They are running away because there's the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So they are Protestants. Most of them flee to England. Many flee to Switzerland and Prussia, Germany. And they, especially the ones that flee to Prussia, they are cotton farmers, so they really stimulate the cotton industry in Prussia a lot. Many go to Holland. Some go to America. And 150 of them. So there's about 300,000 that leave. 150 of them end up in South Africa, right? So tiny portion. So I don't know, who would have come to South Africa. It must be someone that's perhaps not risk averse. I mean, you know nothing about the Cape Colony, and you end up on a ship that transports you to the Cape Colony, and they arrive here. Most of them are families, part of a family. And what we want to show is that these guys are somehow different than the already existing settlers in the Cape Colony. And we want to then explore why they are different. That's the key. So we're going to, what our strategy is here is we're going to identify exactly where these Huguenots come from in France. And then we're going to say in some parts of France, you were a winemaker. It was a winemaking region, so you knew at least how to make some wine. Other parts of France are wheat-making regions, so you didn't know anything about wine, but you knew how to make wheat. So we're going to separate these two groups, and we're going to follow how so they are the same in all other respects. They are French, but they are only different in where they come from in France. And so if we see the one group performing very well, then it must be because they are good at winemaking versus other groups. So this is a map just of France. I'm not sure if that's very clear, but the lighter provinces are the ones which are wheat making, and the darker ones are the ones that are wine making. And with these dotted ones or striped ones are the ones that we know of one family that was, for example, a doctor, so we just exclude them, but they are winemaking in essence. So here's just a descriptive graph showing you that the dark line, that's the line, the Huguenots that come from wine-producing areas. And you can see that they are initially better at making wine. So on this axis here, you've got how much wine they make in liters, and this is over time. And what is interesting, I guess, is that at the start they are better, and then they kind of plateau, but they seem to be consistently better than the other groups. But actually, over time, they improve or increase their performance in relation to the other groups, which is surprising because you would expect if you've got a lot of skills in winemaking, you come to the Cape, you make good wine or you sell a lot of wine, and then over time, people learn how to make good wine. Other people, you tell your neighbor how to make good wine, and so kind of the skill advantage disappears. What we are showing here is that it increases actually over time. So we want to explore that as well. Why is that interesting? So we do a regression analysis. So I return to the econometrics. And so all the regression does, what is a regression? A regression is saying we want to explain something on the left-hand side. So you'll see way at the top there the log of y. So we want to explain output. And on the right-hand side, we want to control for a lot of different things, which might explain the output. So we on the y, on the left-hand side is output. On the right-hand side, you'll see we've got a settler group there. That is our dummy variable, meaning if you're 1, then you're from a Huguenot from a wine-producing region. If you're 0, then you're from the rest. And then we also control for various, K is capital, so various capital things like slaves, like horses, like cattle, like number of knechts you employ, all of these things. Labor, well, I guess labor would be knechts, and various other things like time dummies, location dummies, etc. So let me interpret this. How do we interpret this? The important thing with regressions is to look at the stars. Right? So the stars tell you that this is statistically significant, and then the size of the coefficient tells you whether it actually means anything. So you'll see here that Huguenots from wine-producing regions, are better at making wine consistently for all the different types of experiments or specifications that we test. So the important thing here is that coefficient is large, it's positive, and it's significant across all those specifications. And why do we have many different specifications? It's because we first want to run a very basic one and then say, okay, well, it seems to be positive, but then we want to add more of these controls. We then include slaves. So what this is saying is that the a French family from a wine-producing region is better than another, say, a Dutch family, even if they have the same number of slaves, even if they have the same number of knechts, and if you look at these things, even if they have the same number of cattle, of horses, of vines, so vines also in there, right? So even though they have the same number of vines planted on the farm, they are still making more wine than the other family. So they must have some advantage, they must have some skill. Right? And you can think of many different reasons that they might have this advantage. We, in the paper, we control for many different things. You might say, well, they settle obviously in Franschhoek, right? And so it's incredibly fertile. And you can take out the 8 families that settle in Franschhoek and you get exactly the same result. And there are many different such tests that we do. But I think this summarizes it quite nicely. So this is a traveler in the 1730s in the Cape Colony, O.F. Menzel, and he explains a couple of pages in his travel journal, he explains how to make wine. And then he ends with, this is how you make wine, but every sensible man will surely presume that for good winemaking, something more is necessary than what has been mentioned. There is no doubt that many colonists at the Cape do indeed know the secret of preparing good wine, and therefore wines are made which stand the test of time and grow mellower with age, but they are not such fools as to give away their secret and thus make the good wines more common. So what we are saying is that these guys that arrive here, either deliberately, so they want to protect their secret in how to make good wine, so they just keep it within the family, or accidentally, so it might just be very difficult to learn how to make good wine. Right? So you have to grow up in a family where they make good wine. And so they keep this secret over generations, and it's literally generations. It's about 3 generations from 1700 to 1760, 1770, when the last time we measure them. And what is a bit more interesting perhaps is that if you look at this married coefficient here, so this is whether you were married to a Huguenot, non-wine Huguenot or a wine Huguenot. So if say I'm a Dutch settler and then I marry a Huguenot wife from a winemaking family, then that gives me an advantage. Right? She brings some information, some skill into there. So that's a coefficient that's positive and significant. Right? And it's larger, the one from winemaking families, than the one from non-winemaking families, which is, I think, fascinating. So the paper has been published, and I'm more than willing to circulate that. So to give you a sense, that's the kind of research that we do about the Cape Colony. As I've said, the credit records are fascinating, and we are continuing with that. Perhaps just to end off with the Cape Colony and saying that if we draw back now and we look at the kind of broader term perspective, why is this important? Why didn't this wealth of the early South Africa then create, as what happened in Britain at that stage, an industrial revolution? Right? So Britain also were quite affluent, and at the start of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century, they saw the rise of the industrial revolution, the new inventions, the spinning jenny, later the steam engine, all of these things that gave rise to the kind of economy, the modern economy we know today. Why didn't that happen at the Cape? And I think there's an interesting story here with slavery. So I didn't mention this here, but all the wealth, if you take all those 28 things that I've mentioned and actually add all the other products together, slaves are about a quarter in total value of everything that farmers own. And for the rich guys, it was even more. So when they produced a surplus, what did they do, these farmers? They bought more slaves. It's a rational thing for them to do. Why? Because we tend to think in economics in terms of economies of scale, so you can produce more. With one more input, you can produce even more than 100%. But there's also, and I think this is an interesting contribution, is that there's also economies of scope, which are very important for these farmers. Because there's no production allowed in towns and cities. The company restricts the manufacturing of anything. So all production must happen on the farm itself. And so once you buy a slave, you don't only buy someone that can work in the vineyard or during harvest time, perhaps in the wheat, but also someone that can actually start with a tanning plant on the farm, or and you'll find a lot of evidences, a Smith's uncle, or all kinds of small-scale workshops. We call them proto-factories. On the farm, and that allows you then to expand production. And many of these slaves were then rented out to neighboring farms because they also learned skills. And so it's a rational choice to just buy more slaves. Instead, in England, at the same stage, when wages were also high, they weren't allowed to import slaves. They couldn't buy people. So what did they do? They invented new technologies that could replace labor. And so that's when you see the rise of all these new labor-saving technologies. Right. So it's the type of institutions that are important in shaping your economic outcomes. Right. And that's kind of a large debate in economic history literature, and I think that's what the Cape Colony story can tell us as well. So we reached South Africa reached an affluent level of wealth, but it was a plateau. It didn't have the dynamic gains that we saw in Europe. Okay, is this a story only about European history? We try not to be. The reason that it mostly is, unfortunately at the moment, is that a lot of data is only about the settlers. But we are working very hard on trying to collect more data on the non-European part of the population. And so we've got a lot of information on slaves, right? So again, being part of the colony, we know exactly where these slaves come from, we've got their prices, and there's some colleagues of mine in the department that has looked at slave prices and how that involves and what it determines and all of these kind of interesting questions. I'm working with a colleague in Sweden on a paper trying to just count the number of Khoisan people. So we don't have, there's no quantitative estimate, and there are few, but they are very rough, they are guesstimates. So we want to try and get to an understanding of exactly how many Khoisan live on these farms, because we know that they are, and in the tax records they are not counted. So once you now do, and this earlier historians have done this in the 1980s, they calculated the productivity of these slaves, right? That was a big theme in America at that stage, the pre-American Revolution. They calculated the productivity of slaves. And they find that there are high levels of productivity in America, and the historians in South Africa find also that there are high levels of productivity. But I just told you earlier that the structure of the economy was very different. These farms in America had large amounts of slaves working. We had only, on average, 5 slaves. So how can that be? And our story here is that, well, these historians miss the number of Khoisan who work on these farms. And so we try and quantify this, and we go to traveler accounts and journals of farmers, and we find the farmer saying, this day today I rented or I hired 50 Khoisan to work on my farm. And you can then find that farmer in the tax records, and you can add that. And you can make a couple of assumptions, you expand it to all the farmers, and you get a new measure of the number of Khoisan. So that's a Journal of African History paper that's coming out next year. You can also calculate with this a new measure of GDP. So this slide just tells you, if we construct a GDP measure of South Africa, initially it's just the Cape Colony, and later it's South Africa, the blue part, and we put the GDP for England on top of that, you'll see that for the first pretty much 50 years, the GDP of the Cape and the GDP of England is on par. And then you'll see this kind of divergence happening. And you'll see that there's some catch-up towards at the start of the 20th century also, and then you'll see the effect of our isolation towards the end of it. Okay, I'm running out of time, so yeah. Okay, let me skip that. I just want to mention one thing that we are working on, which is a fantastically rich data set, that is the genealogies. So we've got GISA, which is the Genealogical Institute in South Africa, that's based in Stellenbosch. We've got the data, and we have built up, we have cleaned it, which took a very long time, and we can now do a lot of interesting demographic things about these. And again, it's mostly the descendants of European settlers. This just shows you life durations, so it's not life expectancy, and my actual science colleagues will crucify me for this, but it's at least an attempt by an economist to show you how long people lived, right? So this blue line here is for 1650, people born from 1650 to 1700. You'll see the mode life duration here is about 20. And it starts increasing, all the colors are, but you'll see that the kind of mode moves from, say, about around 30 to 40, and the last one here, this line here, is around 65, 70. Life duration of people. This is for the 1900 to 1950 period. So you can see how people's life duration, how long they live, how that expands over this period. So that also informs our economic analysis. And we can do a lot more interesting things with this genealogical data set. But I'm not going to say much more about that now. Let me just say something quickly about the railways. It's going to be 5 minutes. We know that the railways came when minerals, specifically diamonds, were discovered. What we do now is we try and quantify the effect of this. And very shortly, in just a sentence, we find that about a quarter to a third of all productivity gains in the colony during this last half of the 19th century came from the impact of the railways. So if you compare that to other countries in the world, it's only really comparable to the railways built in one or two countries in South America, like Argentina, which was also heavily dependent when the railways expanded into the Pampas. It's the same in South Africa. So what they did was these railways, they would cut transport costs significantly from Cape Town to Kimberley, pretty much. So we know that. We quantify that, but that's not so surprising. It's large. What we don't really know, or at least what we haven't emphasized this enough, I think, is the distributional impact of the railways. So how the railways affected the people of South Africa. And this is what this map tries to show you, is that these railways were built for the purpose of excluding certain people, black people in South Africa, and in our neighboring country, Lesotho. So this graph shows you, the colors show you the percentage of black people per district in the 1911 census. Right? This is the final census we have where black people are still enumerated. And what you can see here is that the railways are pretty much built in areas where black people don't live. So you can see this is the Transkei, or what we later call the Transkei area, and there are basically no railways. Obviously this is Lesotho here as well, basically no railways. Right? So it goes to all that kind of areas, it excludes, and so what happens? Once the diamonds are discovered, Basotho farmers specifically are doing exceptionally well because they are selling wheat to the miners in Kimberley and surroundings. The Free State farmers at that stage are actually not wheat farmers, they are cattle farmers. So they are exchanging cattle with the Basotho farmers for wheat, and these Basotho farmers are increasingly becoming quite affluent until the railways are built. And then the Basotho wheat are replaced with imports from Australia and Wales, wheat imports, and America. And their market falls apart. So there's about 80 miles between where these farmers live and Kimberley. But it's still cheaper to just import grain from Australia and America and sell it on the mines. And suddenly they lose their market. If there was a railway that was built from, say, Maseru, although Maseru is there, that only came a bit later, but say from these areas, or perhaps even these areas, the impact of the railways would have been very different. It would have also allowed for far greater numbers of migration. The mines later in Transvaal, in the Gauteng region we know today, where did they draw their labour from? Not from the Eastern Cape, because it was really difficult to reach these miners. So the miners, they would walk to the mines. We know of stories, but most of the miners came from our neighbouring countries, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and so there again would have been very different consequences. This is part of a larger project, so I just want to allude it to that. And then finally, let's think about 20th century. So this is the product that's been that I've been working on most this year, and it's trying to write the history of South Africa's living standards with data. Like we don't have a history of living standards. So what is living standards? It's just how people have lived over time and how unequal wealth or living standards were over time. So that's what I'm trying to get at. But how do you measure living standards? Especially at the individual level, not like in aggregate counting GDP, but at the individual level. Where do you get data for people, especially black people in South Africa, at the individual level that can tell you something about their living standards? So one way that the international literature has dealt with this in the global setting is to look at people's heights. So heights are genetically transferred, we know that, right? But there's also a large component of heights that are formed in your environment. So tall people would tend to have good nutrition when they are younger. Short people in development literature, they call it stunting. Short people who tend to be bad nutrition or struggle to get enough nutrition to grow tall. So that's the traditional, and it works. If you look at all different kinds of global societies, it's a big field in anthropometric history, it's a big field in the economic history literature. So, you can ask me questions about that later, but it is very valuable. No one has done this for South Africa though, so that's what we're trying to do. Where do we get this information? We get it in attestation forms, forms like this. So when you sign up for the army, everyone fills in an attestation form. So those of you who've seen War Horse, you would know that the guy who would enlist in the army, they ask him to fill in an attestation form in the First World War. Unfortunately in South Africa, my plan was this year to get the First World War and maybe, if I was lucky, the Second World War attestation forms. With the new law on personal information that was signed at the start of the year, we don't get access to the archives. So we have to find new innovative ways of getting this data. The Cape archives are very keen still to help us, so we've had access to the constabulary. Fortunately, the constabulary is actually also in Pretoria, but we managed to get that before the law was signed. And other data comes from the Cape Mounted Police, which is a police force that was in the Cape area at the start of the 20th century. So we digitize all these things. So you can imagine this takes quite a lot of time. You have to digitize all these things, transcribe them into Excel. The constabulary, I should just say, is a police force that is created during the Anglo-Boer War with the aim of repatriating the Boers. So this is a police force for the Transvaal. But obviously the war doesn't end in 1900. That's what the British thought, that the war would end. It takes another 2 years. So the constabulary is a kind of a quasi-military force, and then they become a police force in 1902. So there's about 10,000 observations that we have in this data set. So 10,000 attestation forms. I'm going to skip this. This is just the distribution. And this is what we want to tell. This is the story. So we've got people in this data set from all parts of the British Empire, from England mostly. Most of them come from England, but you can see India, North America, so this is USA and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, different countries in Europe, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and then Southern Africa is Cape Colony and Natal, and the Boer republics are in Free State and Transvaal. And so what can we see from this? We can firstly see that on average the English were about 173 centimeters tall. And English, if you think that is short, on average their weight was about 68 kilograms. So our impression of these guys in the past are perhaps slightly warped by modern movies or something that portray them as these tall kind of fighters, freedom fighters. But they were certainly very short. You'll see though that so here are where's the Boers? These are the Boer enlistees in this constabulary. So this is a certain type of Boer, right? This is perhaps what would be classified as a joiner, someone that fights on the side of the English and then enlists in the constabulary. But you can see that they're kind of significantly taller than the English, and certainly than the Welsh. But all across the colony, these guys are pretty much equal. So the colonies of the British Empire, the people are much taller than in England itself. And that's not, again, so surprising. They've got access to better nutrients, more meat especially, more proteins. And also because English are actually migrating across the empire, right? So that's why they are migrating, is because there are better opportunities elsewhere. And their kids would then be taller. We are doing a lot of interesting things with this, but I think this is where I should stop perhaps. 2 more slides. We are trying to get more information on coloured and black South Africans. It's difficult, right? We can only get it in the First World War, which we don't have access to, but fortunately there was this Canadian scholar who did get access to a couple of years ago. So this is just showing you the height, this is in inches now, the height of white South Africans fighting in the First and the Second World War, on average about 175 centimeters, and the heights of coloured South Africans, right? So large differences. So when does the inequality arise? Well, it doesn't arise during apartheid. That's the point, right? It's already there at the end of the 19th century. And this is for black South Africans. So this is the first time I think anyone in South Africa has seen this slide. This is from Chris Inwood, who just sent me this slide a couple of weeks ago. And this is the height of black South Africans born from 1900 to 1920. And you can see that there's this steady decline, right? So this is something that historians, at least I will consult with the historians and try and come up with a story of why this is happening. Why do we see this persistent decline at the start of the 20th century for South Africans? Is this for black South Africans? Is this a story about exclusion of the labour market? Is it bad? Is it droughts? Is it actually the effect of the Anglo-Boer War, right, at the start, and destruction of cattle and all of these things? We don't know yet, but that's the part of what we hope to achieve in the next coming years. Thank you very much.